Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Swedish Institute for European Policy Studies, Sieps. I'm Göran von Sydow, I'm the director of the Institute, and I'm very happy to open this seminar on making sure that EU actors are held accountable. How do we do it? Now, Sieps is a small institute that conducts and promotes research on themes related to European Union and European politics. Through collaboration with external scholars, we aim to function as a bridge between the world of academia and that of policymakers. By organizing seminars like this one or issuing studies like the one we are to discuss here today, we hope to increase the level of understanding, analysis on issues relating to European integration and European politics. And today we're very happy to present the most recent study, Political Accountability in EU Multi-Level Governance, the Glass Half Full, by Professor Yannis Papadopoulos, which provides a general overview of the notion of accountability in the EU. And why focus on accountability then? Well, there are obviously numerous reasons, but to begin with, accountability is a key component, a central component in any democratic political system. One needs only to look at the Swedish constitution and the first article of the instrument of government, which reads that all public power in Sweden proceeds from the people, proceeds. So there is some sort of element of delegation involved here, because the Swedish democracy is then organized according to representative and parliamentary principles. So chains of delegation need to be paired with functioning systems of accountability. Now, if you look at the EU multi-level system, then obviously accountability it does not necessarily need to be, but it can be more difficult to locate the right elements of accountability. That has also to do with the fact that the European Union is constantly developing and evolving. It involves new centers of power and accountability need to be found in some sort of symmetry or balance, that where power is exercised, accountability needs to be present. And furthermore, as many observers would indicate or note, is that the European Union has also developed over time to move into policy areas that are more deeply politically contested or indeed politicized, which calls for greater need for political accountability. There is currently a discussion in the European Union. There is actually constantly such a discussion, but now also formalized about the future of the European Union that takes form in the Conference on the Future of Europe. And the organizing principles of our democracies should be included in any such discussion, and hence also accountability. Now, my task here is pretty simple because I will now hand over to today's moderator, Anna Wette-Ryde. She is senior researcher in law and also deputy director here at Sieps. And she has initiated this project and she's also organized this little webinar. And we will meet a number of brilliant scholars here today. So I'd just like to, before handing over to Anna, extend my big thanks on behalf of Sieps that you are able to join us here for this discussion today, which I'm very much looking forward to. Now, with that said, over to you, Anna.
Thank you, Göran, and also a warm welcome to all of you from me and also to our viewers. I must say that I have been looking forward to this seminar for more than 2 years when we first initiated it. And unfortunately, we are still in the digital format, but on the other hand, I don't think that we would have been able to gather such an excellent panel without the digital opportunity. So we're very pleased about that. Before introducing the panel properly, I would like to give you some brief background to this project. Sieps has been following the European integration process for more than 20 years. We've been looking at how the legislative process has changed, not the least through the introduction of the co-decision procedure, the development of more and more EU member states. We've had rising populism, we've had a crisis that have struck the European continent. All of these topics are examples that have effect on today's discussion. It is clear that these political changes, that these changes are not only political, but they also cause institutional changes. And this has implications for the political accountability and its way of operating in the European Union. And as pointed out by Professor Papadopoulos in his report, The EU system for political accountability relies a lot on the horizontal dimension. That is to say, the EU institutions largely hold each other accountable. So this means that when it matters who takes place in these EU institutions. And to give you just one example, the EU institutional dynamics change, as do the conditions for political accountability, when, for example, the member states win the battle to appoint the next president of the Commission at the expense of European Parliament's influence. Who they want for president has potential effects on the legislative agenda for years to come. Also, the composition of the European Council and obviously also the Council of Ministers is reflected in the member states' preferences. The European Parliament, on the other hand, represents the European citizens directly, which means that it's vested with a lot of democratic legitimacy. But does this mean that it's always present in the EU decision-making process? Is it even informed about it? Well, this is a big topic for today's discussions. Even the Court of Justice may change depending on the choices made by the appointing member states, although this court is much more independent in character compared to the policy-making institutions. So against this background, we wanted to illustrate how the EU system for political accountability operates not only in theory, but also in practice. And while this is not an easy thing to do, we were extremely happy when Yannis Papadopoulos accepted our invitation to actually take on the challenge to give us not only the theory, but also the operational structure of the EU as it works today, this system for political accountability. Before I hand over the screen to Professor Papadopoulos, I would like also to give a proper introduction of the rest of the panel who has joined us here today, who will also help us to sketch out the system for political accountability. I will address them as they will discuss, so in that order. Starting by Professor Papadopoulos, who is then a professor of public policy at the Institute of Political Studies at the University of Lausanne. He is a member of several European research networks and is currently also coordinating a research consortium funded by the EU Horizon 2020 Research and Innovation Programme. After your presentation, which will take a bit of time because it's quite an extensive piece of work that you have produced for us, about 40 minutes you will have, we will hear Magnus Blomgren, who is an associate professor at the Department of Political Science at Umeå University, joining us from a bit north of Sweden. Magnus does research in comparative politics, multi-level democracy, and political parties, to mention only a couple of research interests of yours. After Magnus' presentation or comments, we will listen to Katrin Auel, who has joined us from Vienna. She is the head of the research group European Governance, Public Finance and Labour Markets at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Vienna. Her focus is on Europeanization, multi-level governance, and in particular legislative studies with a specific interest for the role of national parliaments in the EU and parliamentary communication. After Katrin's comments, we will have a short break. I think we will do it about 5 minutes just to give everyone a small break. And then we will listen to Professor Curtin, who's joining us from the south of Europe, from Florence, where she's a professor of European law at the European University Institute, where she also is the director of the Center for Judicial Cooperation at the Robert Schuman Center. Before joining the EUI, Professor Curtin was also the chair in European Law and Governance at the University of Amsterdam, where she also founded the well-known Amsterdam Center for European Law and Governance. So a warm welcome to all of you, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing your discussion later on. Before I leave the screen to Yannis, I will also make the note to everyone who's listening that it is possible to send in possible questions to the info@sieps.se email address. You can use your email accounts to send in questions if you want to pose any to the info@sieps.se. You can find us also on the website, and I will, towards the end of the seminar, I will look at this email and then read it to the discussant group. So with that said, please let us hear about your results and the way you approached. Please, Yanis.
Thank you very much, Anna. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and dear colleagues. Let me perhaps try to share my screen as I have some slides. Well, first, let me warmly thank the Swedish Institute for European Policy Studies for trusting me and commissioning the report that I'm very happy to present today on political accountability in the European Union. I'm grateful to the whole Sieps team for the great work, also in preparing today's session. And I'm also, of course, very grateful to my outstanding colleagues who kindly accepted to comment on my report today. Of course, it's a pity indeed that we cannot meet face-to-face, but online events such as this one, at least they have the advantage to facilitate attendance, even though just virtual. Maybe some introductory words on my report. Well, the aim of the report is to offer an encompassing view of the issue of political accountability in the EU system of governance. It relies for that purpose on, I think, a thorough survey of the existing secondary literature and on the consultation of official documents. The report concentrates on the subset of accountability procedures in which the control function is performed by democratically elected representatives, so members of parliaments at European level and at national level too, although I have to say I dealt more superficially with the national level in my report. So this is horizontal interinstitutional accountability, as Anna already mentioned. And in addition to that, there is, of course, also accountability to European citizens, although this form of vertical accountability is less prominent in the European system. Coming now to the main points I'm going to address today, they are the following. You can see them on the slide. Well, first, I'm going to talk about what I find the relatively limited contribution of parliamentary empowerment to horizontal accountability. Then about the negative impact on accountability of opacity and informality that characterize intergovernmental bargaining. Third point, the accountability of the European Commission. Fourth point, the reversal of parliamentary empowerment in the area of economic governance. Fifth point, what I call in my report the rise of the unelected and the advent of the technocratic complex in EU governance. And last point, what happens to vertical accountability in a context of politicization of integration issues. Let me start with parliamentary empowerment. We can also call it parliamentarization. In the last decades, and especially with the Treaty of Lisbon, the most significant improvement with respect to the initially somewhat defective democratic accountability of the European Union has been parliamentary empowerment that took place both at European and national level. However, I think this process encounters limits, and its contribution to democratic accountability should not be overstated. Well, first, as regards the European Parliament, on the one hand, it is indeed an important partner vis-à-vis both the Council and the Commission. In decision-making, a partner in decision-making, with its role as co-legislator in the ordinary legislative procedure, and in executive legislative relations, since approval by the European Parliament is required for individual Commission members and then for the whole Commission. On the other hand, however, the European Parliament continues to not play the same role depending on EU policies. EU governance is actually divided between two regimes. I use here the distinction by Professor Fabrini, the supranational and the intergovernmental regime. It is in the supranational regime that the European Parliament has increased its institutional power. So, since endorsement by the European Parliament is necessary, well, horizontal interinstitutional accountability exists in practice because the European Parliament can veto legislative proposals from other EU institutions. In the intergovernmental regime, however, the European Parliament remains sidelined. In addition, there is a negative side effect of the empowerment of the European Parliament. I think it's an unforeseen effect with regards to accountability, which is the development among EU institutions of negotiations, trilogues, with a view to securing legislative compromises. These negotiations lack, despite some improvements, they lack transparency. And this, of course, impedes the accountability of decision makers to outsiders and even sometimes to the European Parliament as a plenum. So in other words, what we have here are confidential forms of accountability that come to the detriment of public accountability to the general public, and we shall see that this is a recurrent feature. As regards national parliaments now, some among them have indeed also experienced a re-empowerment process on EU affairs. There is, nevertheless, considerable variation in their ability to fight back and to control the national executive when it is involved in European policymaking. And similarly to what happened with trilogues at EU level, parliaments tend to be more influential when they succeed in becoming involved in informal negotiations with their government. And this, of course, implies the trade-off that I just mentioned between confidential and public forms of accountability. The influence of parliaments has also expanded with the early warning mechanism that was introduced with the Lisbon Treaty. So this mechanism allows parliaments to indicate when the subsidiarity principle is in danger of being violated by a piece of legislation proposed by the Commission. The mechanism is not used frequently, and overall, I think that the corrective effect of accountability to national parliaments appears limited. There may exist, however, more indirect and more diffuse effects, such as a possible increased sensitiveness on behalf of the EU Commission of the European Commission on subsidiarity issues, maybe or possibly also learning effects for national parliaments through, or some of them, through this form of direct participation in EU policymaking. Intergovernmental bargaining. Well, besides the enhanced role for the European Parliament, the Lisbon Treaty brought the main intergovernmental institution, the European Council of Heads of State and Government, within the legal order of the EU, changing its status that was informal previously. So the European Council is the highest political institution of the EU, the driving force of political developments. It assumes the tasks of strategic planning and leadership. It has emerged as a center of gravity in the field of economic governance. I'm going to talk about economic governance later. But intergovernmentalism also prevails in new domains of EU activity. And I think this raises several issues with respect to accountability. The first one is that intergovernmental negotiations are prepared by administrators. Think of COREPER, who can enjoy quite some discretion, leading to a de facto extension of the chain of delegation. Second, well, even though each member of intergovernmental bodies is formally accountable at home to its own national parliament and electorate, it is difficult for citizens to assign responsibility when many participants are involved in negotiated decision-making within a collective. This is what we call the many hands problem. In the case of the European Council, lack of visibility is aggravated by the fact that it is quite an opaque institution. Its decisions are frequently taken by consensus after informal and secretive negotiations. Third point, intergovernmental bodies, well, obviously they take decisions that have Europe-wide and not just national implications without being held accountable as collectives for those joint decisions. Finally, whenever intergovernmentalism is asymmetric, as it happened during the management of the Eurozone crisis, well, peer accountability among governments, so mutual control between governments, which is often praised, well, it operates imperfectly if the bargaining power of governments is unequal. Probably, in my view, the most salient example of informalization in policymaking is the constitution of the Eurogroup. Despite its considerable de facto power on Eurozone member states in terms of coordination of national fiscal and budgetary policies, its legal basis is minimal, its accountability very limited. The Eurogroup's president regularly appears before the European Parliament to answer questions. But this, in my view, is a thin accountability regime that contains no corrective mechanisms. This kind of, let's say, merely discursive form of accountability, which, in addition, in the case of the Eurogroup, is voluntary, I think this is just it cannot be considered sufficient. Besides, informal working methods are extensively used in the Eurogroup, and there is an influential preparatory body that is composed of secretaries of state and also involves representatives from the Commission and the ECB, the European Central Bank. This is the Eurogroup Working Group, which plays an important role in the discussion of the national draft budgetary plans and the euro area recommendations that are part of the European semester. This group also operates without any formal procedures and in a confidential manner. So Eurogroup and Working Group are, I think, illustrative of the accountability gaps, deficits that characterize political and administrative bodies which enjoy de facto authority, but operate with limited transparency and, I have to say, in the absence of delegation, formal delegation and a formal status. This de facto authority of the Eurogroup is also the backbone of the power of its alter ego, similar composition, that enjoys formal authority, the European Stability Mechanism, the ESM. This is a peculiar construction, as it is an intergovernmental institution outside EU treaties, and which to a large extent formalizes the asymmetric nature of intergovernmentalism. The Eurogroup's informal nature and the intergovernmental setup of the ESM, well, they both allow finance ministers to evade EU provisions on transparency. With regards to political accountability, the image is mixed, to say the least. The accountability of ministers to national parliaments is unevenly developed. And in addition, since votes on capital matters in the ESM are weighted according to the size of national contributions, well, accountability to national parliaments may legitimize domination by the most resourceful countries. As regards accountability of the ESM to the European Parliament, well, its absence illustrates, I think, the sidelining of the European Parliament in the design of the ESM. The ESM seems aware of criticisms against its transparency and accountability deficits, and it seeks to counteract them proactively. However, as I said before, this form of voluntary accountability, I think, cannot be considered sufficient and also remains thin because it is limited to the provision of information. Coming now to the Commission, the European Commission. Well, especially developments in the field of economic governance have strengthened the role of the Commission. Crisis management has largely been intergovernmental, indeed. But the Commission thereafter turned into the guarantor of the commitments agreed by the governments. it exerts an ex-ante control over national budgets. And this, well, intrusive role obviously impinges on the traditional role of national parliaments, whose budgetary sovereignty is a key prerogative. The Commission became more generally a pivotal actor in the coordination and supervision of macroeconomic policy, while the European Parliament carries no formal powers to veto or to amend the country-specific recommendations that the Commission issues namely within the framework of the European semester. Although the formal decision-making side is the Council, the ECOFIN Council, finance ministers, the recommendations of the Commission become binding unless the Council objects using this quite peculiar procedure of reverse qualified majority voting, but this is a somewhat different problem. Now, the question one might ask is whether the Commission's accountability matches its power. Well, the Commission has made progress with respect to transparency. It also became increasingly accountable to the European Parliament. This is, I think, an important facet of the relative, yet significant parliamentarization of EU governance. Despite improvements, however, I also need to emphasize that the fact that none of the parties Spitzenkandidaten became Commission President after the last European election, this, I think, appeared to all as a major setback with regards to parliamentarization. More importantly, with regards to accountability, there is still, as we know, a major formal weakness because, unlike in standard parliamentary government, well, in practice, the European Parliament is not in a position to dismiss the Commission in case of political disagreement. Both progress and limits have also been observed regarding the accountability of the Commission to the European Parliament for the about 2,000 rules that the Commission issues on average every year. This is a lot. It's about 3/4 of all legislation. And these rules are based on powers that are delegated to the Commission by Council and Parliament. The Treaty of Lisbon introduced a new category of delegated acts for which full veto and revocation powers are foreseen for both for the European Parliament and the Council. However, the effects of the new system are unclear, as vetoes are very rare. What we know is that the Commission and the European Parliament exchange their views early on in the process, so that the delegated act eventually survives legislative scrutiny. However, and similarly to the case of trilogues, well, the empowerment of the European Parliament on that matter leads to informal negotiations, this time with the Commission, which, as I tried to point out before, are hardly compatible with public accountability. And I think the improvements should be nuanced, qualified for some other reasons too. The Lisbon Treaty gives no clear guidance regarding the choice of instrument, delegated instrument and procedure. And this gives rise to many institutional conflicts between the European Parliament and the Council. And recent empirical research concludes that the Council, whose consent is required, agrees to involve the European Parliament only when it considers the Parliament as an ally. So parliamentary control, we can say, is limited, and the role of the European Parliament relatively subordinate. In addition to that, but that's a different fact. That's a different factor. Crisis legislation and the intergovernmental treaties that followed, they were generally unfavorable. They were not favorable to the European Parliament that had just been empowered with the Lisbon Treaty. With the Economic and Monetary Union, the EMU, the European Parliament lost weight as an accountability audience or forum, whatever we call it, because, well, the other decision-making bodies can ignore its opinion. It is true that more frequently now, representatives of different EU institutions that are involved in economic governance appear, they do appear before the European Parliament as in the economic dialogue. And what they do is that they explain, they justify what they do. However, I want to emphasize this again, this thin form of accountability, I think, does not offset the more general phenomenon of parliamentary sidelining in economic governance. When exchanges of views and information rights are decoupled from the authority to decide sanctions or to block action, this is not more than just a minimalist version of accountability. In addition, the benefits for effective parliamentary scrutiny, both of information rights that have been acquired by the European Parliament and of multi-level cooperation between European and national parliaments, these benefits seem to be uncertain. The limitations are not just due to formal obstacles, but also to the constraints of the agendas of parliamentarians, priority issues, and also to collective action problems that parliaments encounter. Regarding more particularly the role of national parliaments in economic governance, there's again quite some cross-country variation in their capacity to adjust to the centralization of budgetary competences in the hands of the Commission and the Council. However, the general picture I found is that parliaments do not have much substantial power in practice to review or to amend the intergovernmental agreements in the field of economic governance. Unsurprisingly, parliaments, they are more sensitive when they are motivated by highly politicized issues. But we encounter then again this familiar phenomenon that their parliamentary activism tends to translate into stronger bargaining power that is wielded vis-à-vis the executive in secluded arenas, so to the detriment of public accountability. In addition to the power of intergovernmental institutions, which, as we have seen, is weakly checked, well, increasingly important supranational actors are guardian institutions that form a technocratic complex, primarily the European Central Bank and numerous European agencies. The main issue is to conciliate the independence of these bodies with accountability requirements. However, apart from intentional limits that are set to their accountability, I think we need to mention additional limitations that result from practical constraints. Moreover, their formal accountability status sometimes does not keep up with their changing functions. Let me start with the European Central Bank. Well, its very high level of independence, treaty-based, coupled with a significant expansion of its activities in the last years. This, I think, made the issue of the political accountability of the bank particularly prominent. The formal accountability of the ECB, primarily to the European Parliament, less so to Council, the Eurogroup, well, is limited to its discursive dimension, or as Paul Tucker puts it in his book on unelected power, the explanatory dimension of accountability. It is mostly structured around the provision of information, reporting obligations, because the bank's independence excludes the enforcement of sanctions. Another limitation is that the ECB is subject to standards of professional secrecy, even though it recently opted for being more proactive in communicating to the public, the media and markets. For example, the quality of exchanges between the bank and members of the European Parliament is questionable under the joint effect of these confidentiality requirements and the weakness of in-house expertise on technical matters within the Parliament. A similar mixed picture appears when looking into the accountability of the ECB in its new tasks as the main banking supervisor in the euro area. This is a policy field in which the bank enjoys less discretion and the European Parliament more powers. But at the same time, the mandate of the ECB is broader, fuzzier, making the practical exercise of accountability more difficult. The European Parliament manages to trigger debate and to gain influence through in-camera meetings of ECB executive staff with committee members. This entails, however, the usual trade-off regarding the absence of public accountability. The accountability of the ECB to the Eurogroup faces somewhat different problems. Well, primarily because the Eurogroup, as we have seen, is an informal structure that lacks transparency and legitimacy itself. But in addition, it does not seem to be overly concerned with holding the ECB accountable. As to national parliaments, they are unevenly active and remain relatively peripheral. However, I think that accountability gaps are largely due or are also due to the passivity of those who should exercise this function, because they are confronted with a multi-level and networked system of governance that makes the allocation of responsibility difficult. A substantial amount of regulatory power has been also de jure or de facto delegated to many European agencies, and their activities are also expanding. Similarly to the ECB, the existing formal accountability mechanisms do not always keep pace with frequent situations of mandate expansion. The dilemma regarding the accountability of agencies is quite similar to the dilemma regarding the ECB, how to conciliate accountability with independence. But the most powerful agencies, I'm thinking here, for example, of the ESMA, the European Securities and Market Authority, with strong enforcement competences, well, the most powerful agencies do not appear to be subject to much stricter accountability regime than less powerful agencies. As the agency's closest master or principal, the Commission performs an active monitoring role. While the Council is more loosely involved, the European Parliament has been rather strongly involved in scrutinizing agencies. It has used its budgetary prerogatives to sanction agencies out of concerns about lack of independence of their staff from market interests. So the problem of the revolving door phenomenon regarding the turnover of personnel and the related risk of capture. And these sanctions from the EP, budgetary sanctions, they did induce a corrective effect, unlike thinner discursive accountability mechanisms. However, well, agencies also operate in often highly technical fields, so the practical exercise of control is difficult in the absence of failures, blunders, cases of mismanagement, or other kinds of conspicuous focusing events. A different problem with the accountability of agencies is that there is no comprehensive and coherent system of control over their operation. Well, they are politically accountable to Commission, the European Parliament, Council. So they risk being overloaded by conflicting steering signals from accountability forums with different expectations. This is the problem we can metaphorically call the problem of many eyes this time. Interestingly, this is above all, I think, a problem of uncoordinated accountability, not insufficient accountability. We should also take into account that the EU Commission and EU agencies forge partnerships with national agencies in a large number of networks with the tasks of rule enforcement and policy coordination. So to the many eyes problem that I just mentioned, I think we should add the many hands problem, as we know that especially outsiders find it difficult to assess who is acting, who is responsible in such networked forms of governance. So, as I just said, lack of clarity of responsibility is expected to have a negative impact on accountability to the citizenry at large. Indeed, many citizens in EU member states are not familiar with the inner workings of EU decision-making. However, I think that context does matter. And in the last decades, there has been a politicization, as we all know, of the issue of integration. So what happens with politics back in? Does this positively affect the vertical, this time the vertical accountability of rule makers to the general public? Well, empirical research on mass attitudes, this is quite a different body of research. These studies come to mixed conclusions. Interestingly, despite the complex and fluid nature of the EU, European citizens are able to make relatively correct distinctions in terms of what the national and the European jurisdictional level do. they are also able to distinguish between more and less deeply Europeanized policy sectors and to adjust their allocation of responsibility to developments, policy developments. However, those who hold strong positive or negative views on integration, well, they both are more prone to attribution errors. And this is not a surprise. The individual level of political sophistication also impact on one's ability to acquire the necessary knowledge to make accurate evaluations. On the one hand, politicization does matter. It increases the information supply in countries in which the integration issue is hotly debated. On the other hand, being able to better assign responsibility does not mean being ipso facto able to hold accountable. Although voters are provided with a direct accountability mechanism through elections for the European Parliament, the outcome of these elections is, I think, a very imperfect indicator of popular evaluations of EU policies. For many reasons, even this direct vertical accountability linkage at EU level appears quite loose in practice. What matters most, I think, with regards to accountability is that it is impossible to hold accountable in the EU through elections in which governmental parties would compete with challengers. Well, it is impossible to hold accountable something that would look a bit like a party government at EU level, as the executive power in the European Union is to a large extent amorphous. The consequence? Well, the consequence is that distrust and contestation affect the EU as a whole when European people are dissatisfied, rather than just those holding office. And I think this is a major problem for those who are concerned with the future and legitimacy of the European Union. Let me wrap up now. Political scientist Richard Rawls, in his book Representing Europeans, wrote that the EU system is accountable, I quote, up to a point. Well, what I can say is that the political accountability glass is currently half full, and besides, there are no clear signals, in my view, that the glass will be filled up soon. I can mention in that respect, among others, a policy paper that was published a few months ago by Sieps, which concludes that the European Parliament has been sidelined in EU policy responses to the COVID-19 pandemic too. I would, if you allow me, I would like to conclude with 6 main takeaways. First, overall, my evaluation is that with the newer decision-making arrangements, decision-making tends to shift to less accountable arenas. The combination of executive activism, this is a concept by Jonathan White. Well, executive activism, including in informal institutions, such as the Eurogroup, and through treaties outside the EU legal system, such as the Fiscal Compact. So the combination of executive activism with the empowerment, or rather the self-empowerment and the mandate expansion of technocratic bodies, I think these are indeed not ideal recipes for democratic accountability. Second, as regards now the horizontal accountability between institutions, I think one should not underestimate the more assertive role of parliamentary institutions. What is more, especially technocratic bodies, and they do that for reasons of reputation management, they voluntarily opt for being more accountable than formally prescribed, so that their de facto accountability may extend beyond the limits of the de jure accountability. However, parliamentary empowerment remains uneven across policy areas at the European level, across parliaments at the national level, and parliaments are often constrained in their activity by resource limitations in terms mainly lack of time and expertise. In addition, accountability is often limited to reporting and to the provision of information, possibly followed by debates, even though, and this happens frequently, even though in some cases, such as that of the ECB, well, the European Central Bank, one cannot advocate much more than the perhaps consolidation of such a thin imperative to communicate and to justify. I think one should set as a general goal not just the formalization of discretionary accountability relations, but also the thickening of accountability relations. Third point, as regards now the vertical accountability to citizens, which is, we know, the most direct form of democratic accountability in representative forms of government. It is indeed limited in the European system. The only directly accountable EU institution is the European Parliament, but even the Parliament's democratic accountability in practice lacks substance, given the weak electoral connection between the Parliament and European citizens. Fourth, I think we also need to keep in mind this recurrent trade-off, that parliamentary empowerment triggers bargaining strategies, including in informal and sometimes secretive settings, and such confidential in-camera negotiations, well, they undermine further vertical accountability to the general public. More generally, informality seems to be on the rise. It may be deliberate or just result from improvisation, I don't know. But whatever its reasons, I think the codification of informal procedures, coupled with their enhanced visibility, this can only be beneficial to public accountability. Fifth point, we have also seen that the now expanded intergovernmental and technocratic power is actually fragmented between the Commission, the Council, the European Council, the European Central Bank, agencies, and EU agencies, national agencies, and European and national governments. And this within a multi-level political and administrative system. Even though progress did occur in the recent years with regards to the transparency of individual EU institutions, horizontal accountability, but I would say even more so vertical accountability to the European general public, is hampered by the difficulty to allocate responsibility in a composite system of authority, which is characterized by complicated geometry, shared tasks, and cumbersome multi-level processes. Last point, well, of course, it's not only defective democratic accountability that is at the origin of the growing Euroscepticism and sovereignism in many countries, with this leitmotif of take back control that we heard during the Brexit campaign. There are other factors, such as the perceived negative effects of and costs of specific policies that are correctly or wrongly attributed to the EU. These factors also clearly play a role. However, many people are skeptical, also because they regard the EU as unaccountable, regardless of the fact that, as I think as I noted in my report, the accountability deficits exist but are not pervasive. Therefore, I think that improving accountability in the EU system, is not just a normative desideratum. It could definitely contribute to the legitimacy of the European Union in a context we all know of increased politicization and contestation of integration issues. Well, I'm afraid I have exceeded the time that was generously allocated to me, so I will stop at this point. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm, of course, very much looking forward to the comments and to our discussion.
Thank you, Yanis, for this, making it possible to actually summarize such an extensive report in such a comprehensive way as you have done now. And you mentioned even in your in the title of your report that you say it's a half full glass, and it's of course in the spectator's eyes what you mean by that, because I would presume that some people would be happy with a half glass, but I also take with me that you are not, Yanis. And with this said, I'm looking very much forward to how the rest of the panel look at this system and whether a half full glass is fine enough or whether we should fill it up. So please, Magnus, you have the screen.
Thank you. First of all, I want to say thanks for being invited to join and to be able to attend this very, very interesting seminar. In many respects, very interesting seminar, I will say. And I'm looking forward for the discussion. And I would like to say thanks to Janice for an excellent report. The overall problem it addresses is perhaps not new. I mean, this is in many respects a result of many years of research. But the report still manages, I think, to introduce novel thoughts and ideas to put into the debate. And it is especially the discussion about the new, or at least enhanced, role of the European Council and the various technocratic expert groups that I think is the main contribution that you do so well in the report. But I also want to say that the report is a great synthesis of years of research in many aspects of this huge topic. And I think this, to gather all these kind of studies and all these kind of contribution is actually a contribution in itself that I think is worth mentioning. And as the report explained, and also your presentation here, is that the power for the European Union runs through basically two chains of delegation: the intergovernmental chain with the national parliament and government as the main institutions, and also the supranational chain, whereas the European Parliament is the main institution. And it is also, I mean, this is kind of basic, it is also along these chains that accountability may be executed. And in general, I absolutely agree with the conclusions in the report. And I will say a few words to kind of underline some of the argument and perhaps contradict some of them, at least give a little bit different perspective. But basically, I want to underline some of the arguments that you present, which I find very interesting and important. And maybe I focus a little bit more on the vertical dimension of accountability than the report, but I mean, these things are connected, obviously. Much of the debate on the European Union and accountability has been focused on, at least according to my perspective, on the intergovernmental chain of delegation. A large number of studies have compared how member states organize European affairs committees, the efficiency of early warning systems, yellow cards, etc., etc. And the common picture, at least as I read it, is that these measures are pretty weak and have a limited effect on the government's work on the European level, in practice at least. And even less so when the final decisions are made in the European Union. And the reason is, well, there are several. One is that the government's information privilege, of course, as well as the access to formal and informal negotiations on the European level. Well, this gives the governments an upper hand towards national parliaments, of course, and much of this is in the report as also explained in the presentation. And the increased role of the European Council has strengthened the governments even further, I would say, and this is also concurred in the report, I think. And as I see it, what follows through this is an almost non-existing political debate on European Union issues, at least in the public space or in the public sphere. Even though it is reasonable to think that many of the questions discussed should logically stir up a lot of debate on the national level. I mean, if you look at the Swedish context, a number of issues, I mean, we would expect that many of them would stir up a lot of debate. Maybe we can return to that in the discussion later on. Does this lack of discussion, debate, politicization, if you may, does this mean that the government is not held accountable when it comes to its involvement in Brussels? Well, that's the main issue here, of course. And I would say that the answer is no. If the government's strong role in the process means that there is no reasonable chance for the opposition, the parliamentary opposition, to really deal with these issues and to formulate relevant critique. And this is a conclusion or a view maybe that I believe has guided much of the research in this area. It has certainly been an important perspective for me myself. And therefore, we have argued that for stronger parliamentary measures, for example, access to documents, giving mandates to the government or to the ministers, broaden the parliamentary involvement, cooperation between national parliaments, etc., etc., as a strategy to make the national parliaments even stronger in terms of securing accountability, basically. And the expectation has been that if national parliaments are better equipped to control governments, the better accountability we would get. However, I have actually, the last few years, started to reconsider this position. Because if politicization is an important part of accountability, which I think the current situation leaves quite a lot to wish for, and I guess we could agree on that. And if the problem is the government's control over EU issue, wouldn't the opposition, the political opposition, the parliamentary opposition, sooner or later react to this? Wouldn't media start asking questions? Voters organize alternatives, etc. We've seen very little of this, and this is a fact in Sweden, I would say, and I guess a relevant picture also in most member states. And the problem that we are discussing here today, the relationship between the levels and between different institutions, is not politicized as such, not even among politicians. It is really we as a group of political scientists that really problematize these kind of relationships. I do not mean to offend someone, of course, here, but this is what I would say more or less a fact today, and has been for a while. Because what we can see is a parliamentary opposition that is involved in the process, and it has increased during our 25 years as members in Sweden, at least, and also in other countries. I mean, we have a lot of studies that show this. And it's obviously that the political opposition seems to be reasonably content with the result. Otherwise, it would probably act differently. The problem here, and I think this is in the report as well, the problem is that the ordinary citizens has a very limited access to these discussions, even though the opposition might have, I say. And even though the national parliament as such might have some kind of influence, and maybe it's even have increased, I'm not sure about that, but even so, if the connection to voters or to citizens is lacking, then we have accountability problem to begin with. Because this means from a citizen's perspective that the intergovernmental chain of delegation is not that helpful, actually, according to me, to hold the EU decision makers accountable as it is today. At least if we by accountability means some kind of public involvement. And as you show in the report, the political dynamic with demand of unitary action from member states, more or less informal relationships or negotiations, which also increases, simply is not that well suited for more open, public, and thorough debate. And in this sense, European Union still is a kind of elite project and will continue to be so. That is, if we only look at the intergovernmental chain. However, the supranational change might still be the way to go here. As the report also argue, at least according to my reading, the increased parliamentization of the European Union has meant that the horizontal accountability has increased. And I agree with that. However, also here we find several well-known problems. The two most serious ones, according to me at least, is the second-order character of the EP elections, which is no debate, and also the lack of responsible pan-European political parties. Both these problems are connected, according to me at least, from where I come. Both these problems are connected to the inability of the national political parties to incorporate the European level into either their organizations as such or into the political message, and also to have conflicts about these issues. Therefore, the result is that the connection between the voters and the European Parliament must be regarded as very weak, as you also mentioned in the text, more or less. And in that sense, the parliamentarization of the European Union, or the strengthening of the European Parliament as such, might actually constitute a problem. In the long run, horizontal accountability is not that much worth if the popularly elected institutions are not linked to European citizens. So that I find is the crucial question here. And still, as things has developed in the European Union and also on the national level, which is important to remember, I think that strengthening the supranational chain of delegation is basically more or less the only strategy to create real accountability in the end. And I would promote reforms in that direction, even though I know these are very hard. I'll stop there and look forward listening to my colleagues here. Thank you.
Thank you, Magnus, for these interesting comments. And I think that we also get a good opportunity here to draw the attention to another Sieps publication that you were a co-author in. It's called EU I riksdagen, the EU in the Swedish Parliament, where you also noted this, and I liked your narrative here during your presentation, that you, in that article, you noted that the opposition is quite strong and that should serve a certain function for the accountability perspective. But on the other hand, you have now also identified that it perhaps is not enough, and perhaps we need to do a EU Riksdagen 2.0. So I will get in touch with you just after. But before, because I think this is also gives us a very good opportunity to present our next speaker, who is Katrina Auel, of course, and you also contributed to this report a couple of years ago.
Thank you very much, Anna. Thank you also very much for the invitation to this seminar, which is not only timely and very important, but also highly interesting. And of course, thank you, Jannis, and congratulations on this excellent study, which I very, very much enjoyed reading. And I agree with a lot of the analysis in your paper. So, and incidentally, I also agree with a lot of what Magnus has just said. And I will in part sort of come to similar arguments. So I want to focus on 3 points that are related mainly to my field of expertise, and that is, again, the role of national parliaments in the EU. And the first one is a broader point that relates to the concept of accountability as such. And the second one then will, the second two will relate to the role of national parliaments and in the way that they can possibly contribute to accountability in the EU, both individually and collectively. And maybe here my suggestions are sort of slightly a bit more hands-on, and I would love also to get some feedback on this from the audience, for example. Yannis, you mentioned in your paper that accountability should not be conflated with representation, and that accountability is about opportunities that exist for the control of output, regardless of whether they mirror democratic input or not. And I agree that interest representation in terms of input legitimacy and accountability should probably be kept separate analytically and for conceptual reasons. But I would argue, and I hope, Yannis, that I'm not misinterpreting you here, I would argue that the broader concept of representation, if we define that as acting on behalf of that, is more encompassing and also includes accountability. And there's two related arguments that I would like to make. First, the beauty of representative government is, of course, that it is not exhausted in the act of selecting representatives. It's also based on the fundamental principle that the people get to judge whether the representatives they have chosen have represented them in a way that they approve of. And for me, that means that parliaments are not only accountable to citizens, they also hold executives accountable on behalf of their citizens. So I would argue that holding executives accountable, either in domestic or in EU politics, is part of the representative portfolio of national parliaments. So as a result, I would also argue that for parliamentary accountability, the question of how output mirrors input is actually important. And here we could, for example, distinguish between procedural and substantive accountability, where the former is related to the process by which particular decisions were taken, which also relates to the question of how input to political decision-making was organized. So let me go all the way back to John Stuart Mill. And according to him, one important aspect of democratic representation is to ensure, and I quote, that those whose opinions are overruled feel satisfied that their opinion has been heard and set aside for what are thought to be better reasons. So representatives not only need to account for the outcome of decisions, but I think they also need to account for their decision to act upon the preferences of or in the interests of some but not others. So in other words, for me, accountability relates very much to the democratic principle of justification, which for me follows from a fundamental principle of equality as a cornerstone of democracy. So put differently, equality in representative democracy does not necessarily mean equality in terms of interest realization, but it does mean equality in terms of justification and accountability. And that brings me to the second point. If holding the government accountable is a task that parliaments perform as part of their role as representatives and on behalf of the citizens, then deficient accountability is indeed also deficient representation. And deficient here for me relates to two shortcomings. One of them is a general lack of accountability, and the other one, and you make this point very strongly in your throughout your paper, it's also deficient if there is a lack of public accountability. So in your paper, you point out many of the challenges that national parliaments face regarding their role in EU politics, in influencing EU politics, in obtaining sufficient information. And I agree with all of those. And one you stress in particular is the trade-off between parliamentary scrutiny and influence on the one hand, which is most often effective behind closed doors, or through other informal means, and public accountability on the other. And so what we see here is that over the last years, national parliaments have made a huge effort to provide information on EU affairs to the public. So looking at the Swedish parliament, for example, they provide access to a huge range of parliamentary, government and EU documents via its website. They also provide, what not all parliaments do this, the stenographic minutes of the EAC. Other parliaments complement this with live or web streams of committee meetings. So for me, there are two questions connected to this. This is all very, very good news in terms of transparency. Information on EU decision-making is out there and it can be accessed. The first question, of course, is to what extent does providing information enhance accountability instead of just transparency? And the second is to what extent does that, and this has also been raised by Magnus, to what extent does information actually reach the citizens? And here I would like to ask the question, how many citizens read parliamentary documents? How many citizens read parliamentary minutes in their spare time? How many citizens will actually choose watching a web stream of a committee meeting over other evening entertainment? So I think it is crucial and part of maybe a more thin accountability that this information is on offer, because it can reach specialist audiences that can act as multiplicators. But realistically, the number of citizens that it reaches is probably rather small. So, and I have made this argument for a long time, so people and listeners might actually get tired of it, but I will keep repeating it because this is something I'm really passionate about. Among the most important means of parliamentary accountability, whether this is in domestic or in EU politics, are plenary debates that involve some sort of hearing or Q&A with the government, in which the government has to publicly and in front of Parliament and also in front of a hostile opposition account for what it is going to do and how well it has done so. And I've long argued that by holding governments publicly accountable, by inducing them to explain European issues and decisions, to clarify their negotiation position also within the negotiations situation at the European level, and to justify their negotiation behavior, national parliaments can also contribute to making EU politics more accessible to their national public. They provide citizens with the opportunity to distinguish between different parties' positions on EU policies and to assess which of these positions best represents their own interest. So debates allow citizens to make informed political choices and to exercise democratic control. So in other words, to take ownership of the EU policies. And I think that is something that is desperately needed. And one thing that is also important in terms of the publicity of plenary debate is that, in contrast to most other parliamentary activities, studies have found that plenary debates actually do get fairly regular coverage by the media. So there is the opportunity and the possibility to reach the citizens. Now, clearly, parliaments don't have the capacity to debate each and every EU issue in the plenary. They have to be selective, and they should be selective. So a report by the Swedish Parliament suggested holding a broader annual debate on EU issues, for example, based on the government's priorities, or linked to the publication of the Commission's annual work programme. A number of scholars have also advocated a stronger focus of national parliaments on the European Council, and this has come up both in your studies, Yannis, and also in Magnus's comments, given the importance, the increased importance of European Council meetings and the decisions that the Council deals with. So what we can see is that European Council meetings do generate a certain salience when it comes to public and plenary debates in national parliaments. But in most cases, it is a single debate either before or after the council meeting, a single debate following a statement by the head of government. What one could, for example, envision is a series of debates around a European Council meeting that deals with the different topics that are going to be discussed there. And these meetings could then be flanked, for example, with targeted input from civil society organizations or a more focused interaction with citizens via social media or online platforms. There are a lot of new developments within parliaments on how to involve citizens in this. This may still be a thin discursive accountability, I grant you that, but at the same time, it is also in line with the logic of parliamentary systems where majority parties have the power to sanction the government, but usually they have very, very little incentive to do so. And they don't do that in domestic politics either. It is, of course, the exact opposite for the opposition. The opposition has a lot of incentives to sanction the government, but they usually lack the power to do so. So we should, when we talk about parliamentary involvement in EU politics, always sort of as a blueprint, always also keep in mind what national parliaments do and can do in domestic politics. And I think we should also be wary not to expect more of them than what we would expect of them in domestic politics. That leads me to the third point, the role of interparliamentary cooperation regarding accountability. Yannis has made this point very forcefully. For example, for the European Council, where the individual members are, or at least ought to be, collectively accountable to their respective national parliaments and through them to their citizens. But, and here I quote, as a collective, the Council has emerged as a self-sufficient institution that operates in an accountability vacuum. And Yannis covers the question of intergovernmental cooperation in his study and argues that it is often seen as an avenue for the European Parliament and national parliaments to reduce information asymmetries vis-a-vis both EU executives, EU actors, and their own national executives. And we have indeed a number of studies that show that interparliamentary cooperations in this myriad, both formal and more informal forms, have not only proliferated, but that it has also been fairly successful in providing an arena for the exchange of information and viewpoints amongst parliamentarians. Doubts remain whether it helps parliaments individually or collectively to have any influence. I wonder, though, whether having influence is actually the most important, let's say, task or role for interparliamentary cooperation. There's a discussion within the literature about interparliamentary cooperation and communication is being mainly about providing a representative and deliberative structure among and across member states. Ian Cooper, for example, has coined the term virtual second chamber in reference to the early warning system. And this could also be extended to interparliamentary cooperation more broadly. Through IPC, parliaments can form a collective body that can not only perform a deliberative, but possibly also an accountability function. So far, it's clear that the virtual chamber is far from being fully realized, and Yannis goes into this in his study. But the whole argument does point to the fact that it could contribute to generate something akin to European public space to discuss policies and then link these back to discussions within the national publics. So the last point I want to raise for the discussion, and I don't have a definite answer on these questions that I raise, but it is whether and how interparliamentary cooperation and the sort of traditional flagship conference, COSAC in particular, could possibly be transformed into an interparliamentary accountability forum. In view of the many different bodies and forums of interparliamentary cooperation that have emerged over the last years, COSAC has been in search of a new role and a new self-understanding for quite some time now. And I wonder whether that could be a role for this large interparliamentary conference. For example, program of the incoming council presidency is presented usually by the head of government in the European Parliament. But I see no reason why it could not be fully presented in COSAC. The same is true for the annual work program of the European Commission. It is also true for upcoming European Council meetings. All of these could be presented by the respective representatives of these institutions and bodies and debated by COSAC. COSAC also already does debate aspects of all of these. But I think much of the accountability potential of COSAC is still very, very much unexplored. And it could especially turn into more effective hearings and Q&A sessions. Again, this is a more discursive form of accountability, but it could be made more effective by linking these discussions then back to accountability processes that take place within the national parliaments. There's a number of obstacles here, of course. The willingness of EU political actors to actually give account rather than just the occasional nice speech to COSAC. A second obstacle is that the European Parliament may indeed not be willing to share these accountability functions with national parliaments. We know that there are a number of rivalries between the two levels of parliamentary representation. And a third obstacle is, of course, that at least so far, all forums of interparliamentary cooperation, despite all efforts such as live streaming, etc., take place largely unnoticed by the media and the public. Yet turning them into accountability forums in which high-level EU actors, such as the President of the Council, the Commission presidents, etc., come in, outline, answer, and justify their work programs, their ideas, that could also raise the media profile of COSAC and therefore the public profile. I'll leave it at this, and I'd be very interested in your thoughts on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Katrin, for sharing your perspectives. And I also recall that you mentioned that it's your mantra to say that there is more plenary debate needed. And I'm happy that you have also written it down in one of the Sieps reports. That is the report on the EU in the Swedish Riksdag, the parliament, where you also noted that the Swedish parliament actually got best in test when it comes to interacting in EU affairs. So it does a lot of things well, but it still lacks in the plenary debate. Thank you for sharing these perspectives. And I will ask now, Yanis, if you have any immediate reactions, perhaps if there was any misinterpretation of what you wrote or so. Otherwise, we can move on. No, you are. Then we try to recall now what everyone has said, because this is a long seminar. We wanted to give you all the possibility for a short break, 5 minutes, before we listen to Professor Cartin with also a very long expertise from what we have discussed, but who could also add to this a legal perspective on top of the political perspectives that we have gathered so far. So I'm looking forward to discussing it in further detail after a 5 minutes break. Oh, welcome back, everyone. And I will immediately leave the floor or the screen to you, Deirdre, to listen to your comments and perspectives on this topic today. So please take the screen.
Okay, well, thank you very much to all of you. Thank you for the kind invitation and for this possibility to have this discussion among all of us. I'm delighted to be here. So congratulations also Yannis for a very thorough report, and to Sieps for the planning of this timely seminar. As I'm the last speaker and the only one, I believe, who's not a political scientist, I have interpreted my task this afternoon to go beyond the account given in the report and to situate it in what I perceive to be the real world today, which is also a concern of the author. I wasn't specifically interpreting it as a lawyer, although inevitably that will come into it a little bit, but not too much, because I also appreciate that the focus is on political accountability. So that has also, there's been a deliberate choice made not to look at legal accountability or financial accountability, for example. But I would just like to say that I really appreciate the thorough analysis, like the previous commentators, that has taken place, and the comprehensive literature, which is the backbone of the report, and the very clear summaries of the main points. If, however, the glass is half full, it's also half empty. And one can quibble where exactly the line lies. And of course, you know, what one decides in that regard affects the balance and the conclusion to where we are now. So I note the final conclusion on page 85, which is actually the last page of the report, that not much has been undertaken in the past 10 years for the purpose of contributing to democratic legitimacy and accountability in the European Union. Now, this is a long time, but it's also true at the highest political level of treaty change and all of that. But it's also perhaps not entirely true at the lower and somewhat less visible levels of EU governments, where the deficits are present, often structurally unseen, but yet can also be the subject of some redress, but in a more incremental fashion than, for example, a big bang treaty change or even legislative change. So I'll elaborate various aspects of this point by looking more granularly, first at perhaps what I term the multifaceted nature of executive power at the EU level, above and beyond political executive power. After all, for the less visible, what I would term non-political executive power, there should be accountability too. And I'm quite sure Yannis doesn't disagree with me on that, but also of a type that is linked to political accountability, which is the object of the study. Second, how has this come to the fore in the most recent crisis, that of the pandemic in Europe? I appreciate the report was probably written before that happened, but you know, it's interesting to look at that because it also becomes a sort of new normal, just like the economic crisis before it, but in a different way. And precisely here we see movement in terms of visibility, investigation by accountabilities forums that are linked to political accountability, and what I term loops of accountability that increasingly come to the fore. And this may be a way of pushing the many hands beyond what the author refers to as discursive accountability. So this is my final and third point on the loops of accountability, and it contains the seeds of somewhat more optimism for the incremental steps that can proactively be taken along the way by the accountability forums themselves, that are not only the parliaments, European and national, and that's what we've heard from the other commentators. So as I've said, moving to, in a sense, political accountability for what? And my focus is more what I term composite and interoperable executives. So the classic understanding of political executive of executive power in the European Union is, of course, the political level. It's the governments, the national governments, whether they're in supranational institutions or intergovernmentally or on their own. And it's also the role of the representatives, albeit independent, of the Commission. That's not my focus, deliberately, because I sensed it would be the focus of the other two commentators. But also my work more looks at the more technocratic actors. And there is a discussion of that in the report, particularly in the field of economic and monetary union. And we heard from Yannis now on that, the European Central Bank and the Eurogroup. At this level, one of the striking conclusions in the report relates to the weakness of the accountability arrangements, in particular, the focus on the kind of self-reporting obligations that Yannis refers to. On page 55, he refers to the literature on the discretion of the European Central Bank to appear before national parliaments as ceremonial accountability, aiming to superficially reassure and satisfy the audience without meaningfully revealing any information. But in fact, when it comes to national parliaments, the European Central Bank has in fact explicitly and repeatedly referred to the fact that it owes no accountability whatsoever to national parliaments at all, and that its sole interlocutor is in fact the European Parliament. So going a bit deeper into this reveals two more general points that require more study, in my view, and possibly form part of a more granular agenda for research in this field. The first relates to the considerable discretion that not only the European Central Bank enjoys, but also many other key EU agencies in equally salient fields for accountability, such as the European Medicines Agency or Frontex, for example. So discretion enables actors to control, to a large extent, the information that they put out without any forum really able to assess it, except exceptionally. Self-reporting in the form of annual reports and many other types of reports are often seen as a part of a communication function rather than as a form of political accountability or a public good. Now, the European Central Bank certainly leads the field in that regard, also has considerable experience with regard to the way it manages its own information and projects that, even if it has made some strides in terms of what it will proactively give public access to, whether that's to the European Parliament or to the public. But it's not only the European Central Bank that is subject to standards of professional secrecy, as stated on page 55 of the report, but virtually all actors at the EU level are. These are often self-imposed, relate to the specific areas of activity, and generally they fall under a wider umbrella of more general secrecy rules within the EU, which have been devised by the Council and adopted by the Commission and other actors. And such secrecy standards hugely impact the ability of outside actors, not to mind the public, to understand and know what information is relied on, by whom, and how. If there's no accountability forum to question this, also in some way publicly, how can it be other than a very thin form of accountability? In the context of evolving European governance, the extent to which it is, and is becoming ever more so, data-driven is a huge topic that is not part of this report. I fully understand the reasons that led to its exclusion, but I would, at this point, just say that it cannot be ignored as part of the real world of European governance. And the implications for accountability are huge when it comes to European databases that are accessed by what I would call lower level, you can query the term, but nevertheless, executive actors such as law enforcement or security or health authorities, who controls these actors and the information that is voluntarily or otherwise released by them? What are the implications of what is known as interoperability, which is a much looser and fluid exchange of information of all of this? So my point is that in October 2021, now, while we are discussing this report, I would say that the rise of the technocratic and of interoperable data-driven governance has huge implications for the manner in which we can and should discuss accountability. That's obviously something I can't do justice to now in this context, given time constraints. But when it comes to these newer areas, the glass is very definitely more than half empty, and the literature on it is thin indeed. Study of practice, which in fact I'm doing on an ongoing basis, reveals that much of what the author referred to in different areas, mainly EMU, as discursive accountability, is that's at best what is there. And getting beyond that will require what I will term a truly investigative turn. So let me explain briefly what I mean by that and how that can be related to political accountability. And so basically, because I don't think I've much more time, I'm doing okay? I have about another 5 minutes, or yeah, all right. So basically, I see this happening in the context, and I think you can also qualify it in the context of political accountability, which is within the framing of this report. And that is, for example, so I want to refer to two things, basically. One is the investigative, what I call the investigative turn, T-U-R-N, and the other is what I term loops of accountability. So accountability looping. So it's not network, but it's, one thing leading to another, and back and forth, you can have these kind of loops by different actors. So in terms of investigation, I think the best example of that has also been during COVID, but also before that. And it relates to, in a sense, the manner in which the current European Ombudsman goes about exercising her function. So she really goes into individual cases very actively in terms of investigation and adopts own initiative investigations. And we saw that happening during the pandemic in relation, for example, both to European medicine agencies, but also the European Centre for Disease Control, where, and a lot of this actually was available also via her website, where letters were sent to various actors where they had to release information. Some of it was confidential, but she gave an account of it, and there was a dialogue back and forth. And actually that process persuaded the EMA, both actors actually, but there are other examples, to change their own behavior, to release more information, to more systematically adopt better practices. For example, the European Medicines Agency self-describes what it has done as a response, as a very radical and exceptional transparency in this field, going far beyond what is ever done before. So, being nudged into rather good practices in that regard. I don't have time to go into that in any great detail, and there are other examples, but I was in particular struck by that power of investigation, if you like. It's not a court, so this is not the lawyerly obsession with what courts can do in terms of investigation, because actually what courts can do is always dependent on whatever case has been brought before it and the confines of that particular case. So that may be limited, even if, courts may have discretion. And that was the only point that I really didn't disagree with you, Yanis, when you said, the court had to have its discretion cut down, but, we could have a separate discussion on that. It was only a very, I think that's, perhaps too simple a way of looking at the court, even if there is some rather specific literature.
I'm not sure I said that, Darjin, but
no, there is definitely where you said that. Also citing Dieter Grimm, I think, know that the over-constitutionalization, and in that context that the court maybe, you didn't put it in those words, but essentially have its wings clipped a little bit in terms of very discretionary. You didn't put it like that. Those are my words. Anyway, that's a separate discussion. I don't want to hijack the debate in that regard. But basically, also, so what we see happening with the European Ombudsman, for example, is that on certain issues, trialogues is one of them, that you might have a court case, or you might first have an own initiative inquiry by the European Ombudsman, then you might have court cases, then you might have something being taken up in Parliament, but things can loop into one another and reinforce and assist one another, in a very unstructured way, fluid way, if you like, but that is actually happening in practice. And I think that's interesting in this area. And I don't think that qualifies in the area as, over accountability or too much accountability. But in fact, that the many eyes at different levels can feed into one another in terms of trying to get out more information on the many hands. So that's what I mean by looping accountability. And maybe a final, I don't want to go over time, but a final word about parliaments, and something that hasn't been discussed, but which in the context of the pandemic is to think more structurally, I think, about the role of perhaps investigatory committees within parliaments, be they national or European. Now, there are some legal issues around that, which never have been fully solved, but there are also examples, for example, in the glyphosate saga, where there was a parliamentary committee and that led to ultimately legislative reform and through Parliament. So I think there are other avenues that we can explore. And basically that would be my final comment, is that, there is only, for these more invisible, informal, although they're not all informal, but more invisible actors and the way they operate, we need to have accountability forums in one form or another, and perhaps multiples of them, that can truly have a power to investigate, call witnesses, ask for, which is what Emily O'Reilly could do, get access to documents that was previously not there, look at it, assess it, go and have meetings, query, give reports in public so that you can actually follow it as an outsider. I think movements like that could be very significant, and it's a way of doing something, even if we don't have treaty reform, even if the Conference on the Future of Europe doesn't tackle it or takes forever. So there are small steps, and I think perhaps we shouldn't overlook those. So thank you very much, and thank you for allowing me to participate in reflecting further on these important issues.
Well, thank you very much for all of your interesting perspectives. And the latest one here on the transparency and making all these documents and information accessible to the people. That's also something which has been quite important to Sweden as a country since we joined the EU. We have made observations to the European Court of Justice in all these cases, and also opened some of them, and so to speak. So I know that this is close to the heart of the European citizens. So it will be interesting to see if we get any questions, although I know it's difficult to use this email communication for questions. Another thing I think was very interesting that you mentioned was this the implications of the European databases and how they actually also have implications for the political accountability in the sense you describe. And I think that by saying that, you also kind of emptied the content that was there in this half glass full. We have you open up for a completely new area, which I think it sounds very reasonable, and I would like to follow what you have written on that and perhaps welcome you back in a new seminar. Now I would like to open the floor for the discussion, and I will turn to Yannis and see if you have any instant reflections. Otherwise, I can also divide the word between all of you. And please raise your physical hand when you want the word. So Yannis, please.
Thanks very much. First, let me say that I'm extremely grateful for all these very well taken points. They are all very insightful comments. They're very much to the point. They're also constructive. Now, I didn't see, I think, any major, I say disagreement. So perhaps I am blind or deaf. So correct me if I'm wrong. Anyway, let me perhaps take them. Perhaps not all of them, but one by one. Professor Blomgren's comments. Vertical accountability. Well, vertical accountability is of paramount importance in representative government. I think there is no doubt about that, and I would even add that horizontal accountability, as we know it in the European Union system, is not much if it's not accompanied by some form of vertical accountability. So there are many reasons why the vertical accountability is relatively weak in the European Union. Professor Blomgren mentioned the role of European elections that continue to be, to a large extent, second-order relations. What I would like perhaps to emphasize, and perhaps that was not sufficiently clear in my presentation, is that I see there are two missing links in the chain of accountability that runs parallel to the delegation chain. One missing link is the weak connection between European parties and the European electorate. This is missing. There are proposals for improvements, such as transnational party lists, for example, but this is one missing link. There is an addition, which is there's another missing link, subsequent missing link that further weakens the vertical chain, is the absence of a direct line of accountability of a clearly identifiable European government and the parliament. So when you have both links that are weak, this is clearly a problem for vertical accountability. Another problem is a problem mentioned by Magnus about the weakness of public debate. I mean, not just debate within parliaments between government and opposition, but more broadly public debate. Well, first I would like to say something which is quite trivial, is that this is clearly not an institutional problem. It's not a problem related to the formal aspects of accountability. It has to do with politics. It has to do with political actors, agencies, political parties, also the media, of course, who may or may not be interested in these matters. Of course, the present status quo is not set in stone. It's not set in stone since it is very much a matter of political entrepreneurship. There's more debate today than a few debates ago, because we have now well, perhaps in many countries, the major opposition party is more or less on the same page as the government on European matters, but we have now challenger parties. They are also present in the European Parliament. They are not very strong in the European Parliament. They are nevertheless present. So things are changing to some extent with regards to the prevalence or lack of a public debate. But of course, citizens are less active and less aware of European issues and less active in the debate than politicians. So again, here you see we have a two-step communication process. Parliamentarians may become more aware, not necessarily citizens too. Regarding the 3 points made by Catherine, I completely agree that accountability, democratic accountability, is part of I would say the more general concept of good representative government, and it is indeed a crucial component of representative government, as we can see with the role of the electoral sanction. And I completely agree with Catherine that holding the executive to account by parliamentarians is part of their portfolio, of their tasks as representatives. And that in that regard, a deficient accountability may also signal deficient representation. Now, what I wanted to do is to emphasize the analytical dimension of the distinction. For example, conceptually, you may have a very participatory system, but and very inclusive, but with weakly accountable actors. And maybe there is less need for these actors to be accountable as the system is participatory. This is something that we could discuss. And you can have a decision-making system that is relatively closed, elitist, but in which accountability mechanisms exist. So analytically, I think it's still useful to distinguish between the two concepts. Second point made by Catherine, I think Catherine is right. I did not do sufficient justice to the efforts that are made by a number of parliaments to provide more information on EU matters, although this effort is usually unequal. What we should not omit, however, I think, is the problems that may exist. I was talking about the citizens before. The problem that may exist with the forum, not the actor that provides information, but the actor that receives the information. And we know that many of the accountability problems are not due to problems of the actor that emits and transmits the message, but reception problems, how the message is received or not received. And by the way, this also applies to parliamentarians, but we know that citizens have probably good reasons to behave as rational ignorance. They have other priorities, they have other concerns. So I think this is a more general problem of how accountability operates in practice, and I think we really need to scrutinize what the forums do and their limitations as well. To the last point by Catherine, interparliamentary cooperation. I'm not saying that it is useless. I think I also mentioned that it tends to develop. The question, between talking and having influence is, I think, undecided. I completely agree with Catherine. that the more information circulates, the more these kind of forums are set up, well, the more likely that a deliberative structure, deliberative space will emerge. This, I think, is undeniable. The problem, again, is the coupling of such deliberative spaces with the exercise of power. And in some cases, these deliberative spaces may be quite weak in that respect. Also, the issue of communication with the general public remains. I completely agree, for the rest, that the accountability potential of COSAC may be unexplored, and that the efforts may be weakened by interinstitutional rivalries, the European Parliament not wanting to cede too much influence, and so on and so forth. The last points made by Professor Curtin, well, there are quite some. Yes, indeed, I made the choice. That was a deliberate choice, not to focus on legal and on financial accountability, and this has shortcomings. This has limitation. I think Deirdre gave the example of the, let's say, activist role of the European Ombudsman. This should obviously also be taken into account. Now, whether how do I interpret Deirdre's comments? On the one hand, she seems to say that the glass is emptier than I claim in my report, because the report is a bit blind to some more invisible governance actors and techniques, such as the role of data governance. So actually, it might be emptier than what I state in my report. It might also be fuller because, well, an action such as that of the European Ombudsman may still incentivize these rule-making bodies to adopt best practice with respect to accountability. Perhaps on the role of European agencies. I completely agree with Professor Curtin that they, not just the ECB, of course, but many European agencies enjoy considerable discretion, not just de jure, but also de facto, because we have observed frequent situations of mandate creeping. She mentioned the agencies that have been that are involved in the management of the pandemic, but also Frontex in the case of migration policy. This is clearly, in my view, part of the technocratic power. And the point that I wanted to make clear in the report is that, of course, there is the dimension of, let's say, formally executive power, which is the power of intergovernmental institutions. But to this, we should add this more technocratic form of power, which gains in relevance and importance. Now, are these agencies sufficiently accountable or not? I think it is hard to say. It is hard to say. Because they tend to be, of course, the accountability regime may differ, and as I said, there is no clear correlation between power and accountability, which is indeed a problem. Now, I think it is difficult to draw a very clear conclusion. Take this case of the many eyes problem. What kind of reaction can the many eyes problem generate on behalf of agencies? Well, on the one hand, one can argue that it strengthens their accountability because they are forced to respond to many kinds of expectations. On the other hand, one may respond that since these expectations are uncoordinated, perhaps also conflicting, contradictory, this leaves more room for discretion to the agency. So I think this is clearly an empirical matter, and it should be part of, I think, what the other calls the more granularly approach to accountability, with which I absolutely agree. Maybe last point. Yes, data governance and or data or algorithmic governance. Yes, this is something that I did not tackle in my report. I think this is an emerging research field. It clearly it should not be ignored, and clearly has implication for accountability. On these matters, perhaps on other matters as well, Professor Curtin, I think, advocates a more investigatory approach to accountability, with which I would agree. You know, accountability, we can see it either as an adversarial process, and this is, I think, the investigative dimension would be connected, would be related to that, or more as a deliberative process in which there is more exchange of information, discussion, and so on and so forth. I think that both matter. That's, I think, my first reaction to all these very insightful comments. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Yanis. And I hear there's a conflict dilemma here, because as you all note, there is the lack of political parties in the European Parliament that is strongly vested with the democratic accountability mechanisms. And then we have the national parliaments that struggle on their behalf. And I think we could also mention that the Swedish Parliament has also taken a very special role, in the sense that they have been very clear on the fact that it's the Swedish government that does the EU affairs. So it sticks to its role as controlling the subsidiarity principle through the EVM structure. Also, then you might ask, but will it really find its incentives, the incentive to actually take this accountability perspective? And I think that you, Katrin, also made it very clear when you said that in a representative democracy, the parliaments are not only responsible to be accountable to the citizens directly, but they're also responsible for making sure that the governments are accountable. And that if you divide that and turn it into two roles, it's very clear that it actually puts a lot of pressure on the national parliaments. And they are often seen as the victims in the enhanced intergovernmental decision-making at the EU level. So there's this conflict that you have both the national parliaments and their struggle, and also how this also opens up for more possibilities to go more intergovernmental, to turn into secretive forums of decision-making, as being done in the financial arenas, and so to speak. So my question to you now is, how do we fill up the glass against the background of all these, and the fact also that the EU development is ongoing, and Professor Curtin mentioned only a few such ongoing trends. We have the pandemic, which has poses another challenge to the European Union, when it has to also take very effective and quick, act responsibly, and be very instant in its response. This is another situation, of course. So all this said, how do we deal with the accountability deficit? Anyone, just raise your hands. Yanis.
Clearly, I have no ready-made solution, and the report does not provide, I think, any recipes for that. But my intention was to focus on a couple of problems that are perhaps not frequently addressed, and I think that deserve to become part of the accountability agenda. Beyond, let's say, the big accountability issues, vertical accountability of the European institutions to the European citizenry, or interinstitutional accountability. First thing, informality, in my view, is a problem. This both affects intergovernmental institutions and also the more technocratic part of the executive administrative power. So, are we happy with this informality? I think we are not, and we should not be happy. Second problem, are we happy with these proliferating, developing, and in a sense, this is a positive development. Are we happy with these thin forms of accountability, discursive, explanatory? Nobody, I think, is against. It's always good when rule makers are subject to an imperative to justify, to explain what they do, and so on and so forth. Is that sufficient? I think this is a question that we need to raise. Probably in the case of the European Central Bank, one could not ask for much more because it would impinge on its independence. But I think it should be a matter of reflection, whether these forms of accountability are suitable or not. Third point. Are we happy with a situation in which empowerment is converted, translates into bargaining power that is wielded again informally, confidentially, behind closed doors, so that we have this trade-off between confidential accountability on the rise and the necessity to justify and explain, and public accountability that remains weak, also because the public may not be interested. We have to acknowledge that. Fourth, but clearly this is something on which I don't have a solution, but I think there's a structural problem. It's the multi-level and composite character of the system. It's complicated geometry. Why this is really a thorny issue? Because the multi-level aspect may be necessary, including in its more messy aspects, may be necessary for the effectiveness of policy. Let me take the example of European networks of agencies. I think they're absolutely necessary. They allow to pool expertise. They allow to agencies to, if necessary, emancipate from the pressure of the national government. So this may be functionally necessary, but it is not really promoting, especially public accountability, so to the general public. So typically, these are, I think, issues that we need to reflect upon.
Thank you, Yanis. Well, I hear that informality is a problem, but would the reply then be that we need more formal procedures? You mentioned, for example, in your report that the lack of corrective measures in certain decision-making forums is a problem. Would added corrective measures, for example, when they overstep their authorities in different arenas. I mean, this could be done, for example, as you note, with the delegation of the Commission when it adopts delegated acts, or within the agencies with more corrective measures and the provocation of the court system. Would that help in this, or do we just need to live with the fact that this system has a lot of informal informality built in. What do you say? All the panelists are, of course, welcome to respond now.
Let's maybe ask the other panelists, and I might have a response as well.
Then I think you're free to begin, maybe stimulate the discussion.
I think these are not necessarily two strongly correlated things. One is informality, and quite a different thing is the thinness of some accountability mechanisms. Whether we need all mechanisms to be thicker, no, this is not a universal recipe. But part of the reflection would be to identify which mechanisms should become thicker. For example, I give the example in my report of the economic dialogue. I think the economic dialogue could be improved if there were more corrective mechanisms. Because for me, in the end, accountability. But I know that there are accountability experts who disagree with that view. For me, to me, in the end, ultimately, accountability without any sanctioning, any consequences, be it removal from power or veto against decision. The consequences may be very different. But accountability without consequences, so that those who provide accounts have these consequences in mind, anticipate them, and adjust what they do they take into account the likelihood of consequences. Accountability without this shadow of consequences is not much.
Katrine.
Thanks. I think when it comes to the role of parliaments as accountability forums, one thing that would be necessary, and that was also very apparent from what you just said about the view of the Swedish parliament on its own role in EU politics, is, and I'm quoting Kröger and Richardson here, is to normalize EU politics. Because at least when it comes to EU affairs within the national parliaments, and then as an extension also within the broader public debate, there's still a lot of parliaments that treat them as some sort of foreign policy. And as you just said, there are parliaments, and that includes a parliament as otherwise as powerful and as active also as the Swedish parliament, that sort of takes a step back and says, no, this is the prerogative of the government, and we are here just to, I hope I'm not offending anyone, but to waste our time on the early warning system as a distraction for national parliaments. And to this, I ask, what turns environmental policy, employment policy, foreign and security policy, especially when it concerns the area of internal security, all of these highly relevant policy areas, what turns them into foreign policy if the government co-decides them at the European level rather than traditionally at the national level? Okay, this isn't just a debate on do we want more EU integration or do we want less, and what do we want the institutions to look like? Sort of the sort of debate that especially also Eurosceptic parties like to force this back to. This is about what kind of EU environmental policy do we want in different respects. Normalize this. And normalizing this means, on the one hand, treat it as we treat other policy areas within national parliaments, which means that parliamentary accountability is achieved both informally, but also publicly through debate, through questions and answers, etc. Normalizing, however, also means that we don't, and I'm saying this again, that we don't expect more of accountability forums such as national parliaments, more than they can do in domestic politics. Philip Norton said over 20 years ago, Philip Norton said, the decline thesis means there needs to be something to decline from. Now, the debate on the decline of legislatures, on their influence, on their ability to control the government and hold it accountable due to the specific logic, not only information asymmetries, but also the specific logic of parliamentarism, which leads to a clear sort of unity between the governing parties and the executive. They've started at the beginning of last century. The major work on the decline of legislatures. So I think at some point when it comes to the role of national parliaments, we make the glass a bit bigger than it would be for domestic politics, which makes the content seem less. And I think that is a danger. Use realistic standards.
Thank you, Katrin. We're approaching the end of this webinar, but I would like to open the floor for Professor Curtin and Professor Blomgren, if you have anything to add to the last points to add to this discussion before we wrap up.
Well, now we're really getting started, I think, and I think I completely agree with Katrin about your argument about how to view the role of national parliaments in this respect. But and this is come back a little bit to what you said, Janis, before. What of this is formal, institutional, political mechanisms, and what is basically political? And what is basically a question of different views. I mean, for me, accountability, basically, I mean, if we skip the institutional debate of setups and stuff like that, accountability basically means that we have citizens that are able to control and choose between different alternatives. That's basically what this is all about. But in European politics, both in the terms of the national parliament, in terms of European Parliament, lack that possibility, I think, more or less at least. And if which is perhaps not that odd, since we are in Sweden, or almost, or some of us are at least, discussing Sweden as a kind of role model for how national parliaments deal with European issues. Many of the mechanisms are there. I mean, we have them in several respects, but we still lack that kind of debate. We still lack that kind of discussion. We still lack, I mean, as you so eloquently described, Katrin, in your earlier talk about, well, we have the information, we have the minutes, we have all this stuff. But still, we don't have a debate about the different issues, and we don't have the debate about different alternatives. And the problem is, which I'm afraid of, is that this, in the end, run the risk of turning into a question about more or less European Union instead of what union. And that is the political aspect of this, which is my main concern right now, actually. Well, I think I stopped there. And
thank you, Magnus. And Deirdre, please.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think the difference in what I was talking about and what Katrin, for example, was saying is, which is a very strong point. It's about the power of national governments deciding at the European level. So they just sort of escape in that sense to the European level and are co-deciding in a very active way. But in the, for example, some of the digital stuff that I was talking about, it is national policemen or border officials who are deciding by virtue of data that they have accessed either through their counterparts or databases and taking decisions then that nobody can oversee. So in that area, I don't think it's a matter of formality or informality, or even in the context of agencies. I think it's the reality that many existing accountability forms will simply be logged out, in a sense, of the nature of. So it goes beyond a classic information symmetry or asymmetry, I think. And, something I'm thinking of at the moment is, well, and maybe Yannis would really disagree with that, is, well, do we need a more adapted form of, an overseer that can be logged in more specifically and then can relate back to other political forums? Obviously, it won't be legal or financial, so it will be political. The European Data Protection Supervisor, that's a totally different concept. That's not adequate, in my view, to what we need. But so I agree. We are at the beginning of a discussion, and it's a complicated one and very technical, but I also think it's a real challenge, but it's a different level of power, in my view, executive power. You can quibble about that, but it's obviously not the high level, governmental level executive power, but below that.
Thank you. And unfortunately, I don't have the time to give the floor back to you now, Yannis, but I hope that you felt that you had the time to share all your perspectives. I think that we did not solve the problem of how we fix this, but on the other hand, it seems like part of the problem is that we need to raise awareness of the problem. And probably and hopefully the European citizens and all those who are engaged in holding the executive accountable will actually hear this and do something, get engaged. This could at least be part of the problem. I would like to thank everyone for joining us today, and in particular, of course, our panelists and Yannis for writing this report for us. And I hope to see you soon back in another Sieps format or in another seminar. The world has been broadened through this digital opportunity, and I'm happy about that. So enjoy the afternoon, and thank you on behalf of all of the Sieps team. Bye-bye.